All right, so this is one of the biggest economic red flags that we have seen in a long, long time, and this is not getting nearly enough attention. Almost nobody is talking about this. India has stopped exporting rice. Why is that important? Well, India provides the world with 40% of its rice. Chances are, if you're a prepper and you stockpile rice and beans, you got a bunch of rice that was shipped here all the way from India in your closet or in your basement in your Mylar bags and your 5-gallon buckets. India has suspended the exportation of rice. They provide 40% of the world's rice. Food prices could potentially skyrocket. The only variants they're continuing to export are the basmati and the other more special forms, but it's between 25 to 30% of the global rice is now taken off of the markets. Now, that doesn't mean that the price of rice is just going to go up 25 or 30%, because how it works is if you're starving and there's a 25% shortfall of food, how much are you willing to pay for that? It goes to the highest bidder. So you could see prices double, triple, quadruple for just not only rice, because all other commodities are going to respond. So every other commodity which has to fill in the gap created in the wake of a lack of Indian rice is of course going to go up as well. Now, why is this happening is the question. Why are countries stockpiling grains and rice? Why are they hoarding rice? India is a country of 1.5 billion people on a relatively small landmass compared to equivalent population countries like China or the United States. They have a relatively small landmass and they have a massive population to feed. Why is it that right after this Black Sea grain deal has completely fallen through because the ports of Odessa have been bombed into oblivion? Why is it now that India is saying we got to pull our rice off the markets? This is dangerous territory, my friends. This is going to cause all kinds of upheaval in the third world. If you think that the immigration crisis is bad now, you haven't seen nothing yet. The instability, the austerity that is coming for the world is nothing short of nightmarish if this is a permanent ban on exports. I don't view it as permanent. I can't see how. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Okay, maybe they're pumping the brakes on it and they're going to reopen the market when the price is right. Who knows what the plan actually is? But as of now, they have stopped exporting rice. Now, they're citing a variety of different reasons. For starters, food inflation in India has gone up. And if you live in India, chances are the majority of your income goes to food. In the developed world, the biggest part of people's income goes to food and just staying alive, unlike here where we can spend on more frivolous things. But there, it's very important to keep their population satiated, that they make sure that they keep the price of food down. So that's what they're doing. They're redirecting their exports into imports in order to bring the price of food down so the people there don't revolt against the government. Now, there's other reasons, including the weather anomalies that they're seeing there, record high temperatures, crop destruction, maybe the whole pesticide, herbicide grift is starting to finally catch up with the world. Maybe it's time, maybe it's time that the dominoes just started to fall. I don't know what it is, but apparently they're having some weather issues there as well. They're, of course, also going to be struggling with the fact that now all of Ukraine grain has been taken off the market. Again, people are going to say, well, that's only 5% of the global grain and barley and whatever else they exported. But the thing is, when there's even 5%, even if there's a 1% shortfall in any given commodity that people need in order to survive, it goes to the highest bidder. And people are willing to bid a lot more when they are starving. So a 1% shortfall doesn't mean a 1% price increase. It could mean a doubling, a tripling, a quadrupling of prices, because people's survival is now going to depend on it. The Black Sea deal is dead. It's never coming back. I'm almost 100% confident that you are never going to see the Black Sea deal again, because Zelensky has even today doubled down and said that the Crimean Bridge is a legitimate target and they're going to continue to target it. And Russia will never allow that, which is why they're completely uncharacteristically blowing the shit out of Odessa's grain silos and ports so that they can effectively never be used again. Now, this is out of character for the Russians, who for the most part have been targeting military targets and critical infrastructure. For them to target these silos and to target the ports is one thing, unless they're of the belief that there are military equipment being laundered there somehow. That's a possibility. But there's other things in the works with that whole plan anyways. But the Ukrainians can transport their wheat by rail, however, or by truck, but that's going to cost a lot more. Okay, 90% of their wheat was exported by sea, and that is just not a possibility anymore. It never likely will be again, because they're going to be made into a rump state unless NATO does something quickly, because the Russians are, it almost seems like they're starting to turn it on now. It seems like the gloves are off. This attack on the Odessa silos is unlike something we've never seen thus far. Okay, they're literally targeting food. Now, it could be that there's weapons there, or that perhaps the reason why the grain deal fell through is because they were exploiting this humanitarian corridor as a shield of sorts, so that they could launder weapons, or that they could launch weapons from these places, hiding men and equipment within them, because they know they wouldn't have been targets by the Russians, because that would effectively be targeting a humanitarian mission, right? Now, it's tough to say, but either way, Ukraine grain is not going to get to market now. The Poles have already banned it because they're worried that it's going to drop the price of their own grain. So there's a conflict of interest like that. And there's also the fact that it's going to cost a lot more if they transport it by rail. Do they even have the infrastructure to do that at this point when everything is tied up in the war effort? Okay. So this price of rice issue, that old saying, what's the price of rice in China? Well, the price of rice in China is about to skyrocket. The Chinese have been stockpiling grains and rice for some time. Countries all over the world, Europe included, have been stockpiling rice. The strategic oil reserve is dropping. It's quite possible that we are going to have a natural gas crisis, that the liquefied natural gas is not going to be sufficient to get Europe through the coming winter and possibly the rest of this hot summer. And you're going to see a massive spike in prices once again. Inflation will rear its ugly head. They will try to fight it by continuing to release oil from the strategic oil reserve. I do believe that the only reason why the price of gas is not coming down that much relative to the price of oil is because they know that it's most of the reduction in inflation is due to that depletion of the strategic oil reserve. That's the only thing that's keeping the prices of everything down, is that Biden has been systematically releasing oil from the strategic oil reserve to keep prices down and to try to keep people calm while the shit hits the fan in slow motion. India, at least as far as we know, is now stopping the export of 25%. They're taking 25% of the world's rice off of the global market. That is huge. That could mean different things for other commodities. I don't know exactly how it is going to factor. I'm not a macroeconomist. I don't know how it's going to affect the price of other things in other countries. But I think it's a bad sign that you have so many countries stockpiling, almost in anticipation that things are going to get really bad, and that they now have to start looking out for themselves. Now, in terms of what is going on in Ukraine right now, I really don't know. I've been too busy. I've been out here building bunkies and just doing a lot of off-grid projects. We're restructuring the warehouse. We're doing all kinds of things right now, so I can't do the full meal deal, daily dose of doom and gloom. But there's something certainly going on with what the Russians, their change of tactics as of recent. It appears as though they're really starting to broaden their targets to include less critical infrastructural targets, more civilian targets in the sense of food distribution, obviously the ports, economic targets. It seems that they've broadened beyond critical infrastructure now to economic. And if you have Ukraine going into the winter with a already crippled electrical system that's been bombarded by the Russians ever since last year, they were able to tough it out last year because it was relatively warm. They really did have nature on their side. The ground barely didn't freeze at all. So I don't think if you go by the laws of statistics, they shouldn't have the same luck this year, but you just never know. So I think it's going to be a much rougher year. Not all the silos are going to be full. Not all the gas storage is likely going to be as full as it was last year. And you're not going to have that strategic oil reserve, which was at record highs when this whole thing started. So I think we're entering very interesting times. Now, the tactics of the Russians have changed, signaling that the war has shifted. And you can already see this in the mainstream. They're starting to accept the fact that Ukraine is not doing so well. Now, whether they're doing this to try to garner more sympathy so that we can expedite the delivery of more critical weapons systems, I actually think that's what it is, because they're always talking about, our CIA, our intelligence analysts determined that Putin's never going to use nukes. And anytime they say that, they come out and say that every few months, they send something new. They approve the delivery of something else. The only reason why they're saying that is to appease the American population so that they don't worry about a potential nuclear retaliation. The American people are not going to tolerate sending weapon systems if it potentially puts them in the crosshairs. But if they don't think there's a nuclear threat, then there's a greater likelihood that they will. So it appears as though the angle they're going to play now is Ukraine is losing. They need our help. They need more weapons. But don't worry, our CIA analysts have determined that there is no chance that Putin is going to use nuclear weapons. Now, if you ask me, the Russians aren't doing so well either. And the reason why I say that is because there's been a couple apparently desperate acts as of recent. And again, take this all with a grain of salt. You know me, guys, I try to remain neutral because I don't want to turn out to be one of these Putin shills. Like, I'm not going to name any names. Boy, could I ever drop names. Or a NAFO Ukrainian nitwit either. But I will say that the bombing of the silos, if it was for the specific purpose of trying to neutralize Ukraine's grain market, if it was just to economically cripple them, to me, that's out of character with how they've conducted this special military operation thus far. These are not military targets unless, like I said before, they're being used as cover to distribute weapons or for whatever purpose, okay? We know Turkey is sending weapons to Ukraine. How are they getting there? They're getting there by sea, by these boats. We don't know. Anyways, it just seems like a sign of weakness. Another sign of weakness is that they arrested Igor Grigin. This is the guy who's been free to spout his mouth off about how he criticizes the Kremlin because they're not prosecuting the war more aggressively than they should. This is a guy who's been on the front in the Donbass since 2014. Okay, he was jailed, or he was charged, I believe, for downing a civilian plane. It was some kind of accident. I don't know the whole story. But now he's actually been arrested, apparently. So these appear to be signs of weaknesses. And even he himself had said, whether it's a self-fulfilling prophecy or not, he said that if he got arrested, that means that the Russians were getting desperate. Now, you have the CIA saying, don't worry, the Russians aren't going to use nukes. You have F-16s inbound, and they're saying that they're going to be there faster than expected at the bare minimum before the end of the year. I'm guessing they're going to be there a lot sooner. And you have a lot of other things shaking up right now. Okay, so Putin made this very strange proclamation to the country of Poland just today. And he basically threatened Poland. And he said, look, we know what your plans are for effectively annexing, or how would you call it, neo-colonizing, infiltrating. I don't know what they're going to try to characterize this as, but the Poles and the Lithuanians are effectively going to insert themselves into the western parts of Ukraine, and it's going to become a de facto Polish NATO territory. And he actually said, we're okay with that because we know that you're planning on doing it. We know that there's hundreds of mercenaries there already, thousands of mercenaries there already, fighting on Ukraine's behalf. We're not stupid. We know exactly what's going on. But if you mess with Belarus, then we will view it as an attack on the Russian Federation, and that's when things are going to get ugly. And now you have the Wagner Group situated only 30 kilometers from the Ukrainian and the Polish border. So things are about to get spicy. Now, is this NATO's last desperate act? Is this the point where the big reveal happens, where Zelensky gets on the plane and nobody ever hears from him again? We don't know, because according to Ukrainian commanders, the brunt of their counteroffensive, even though mainstream media now admits that it's not going well at all, they're saying that they still haven't unleashed the brunt of their counteroffensive yet. So it's really difficult to know what is counterintelligence, what is real intelligence, what's a fake out, and what is real. Ukraine is also claiming that the Russians are preparing yet another false flag again at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. I know it's that time of the month. But before I talk about that, I want to say that there's this German arms manufacturer, I believe it's called Rheinstahl or something like that. And I made a comment about this before. You would not have these $100 million companies getting ready to invest in Western Ukraine unless there was some sort of security guarantee. It would never happen. I mean, ask yourself, on what planet would a responsible business from the private sector be willing to put its military production facilities inside a war zone without security guarantees? I mean, it's not going to happen. So they're about to break ground on this, which means that something has to happen before that happens. Something substantial, something, whether Poland moves into Western Ukraine or some coalition of the willing, that is going to happen. I'm almost 99% certain that it's going to happen. It's just a matter of when. Is going to move into that area, and then it will become effectively off limits, as it will become in some ways I was going to say a proxy, but an extension, an enclave of NATO in a sense. And therefore, if the Russians were to target that part, or target troops, Polish troops within that region, who of course will be hiding under a lot of air defense, they're going to be hiding, I'm sure there's going to be some formal line in the sand that is drawn that Russia will probably even respect. So long as their foray into the rest of the annexed territories, and now increasingly looks like more and more Odessa, is not interfered with, although we know it's going to interfere. So the falling out of this grain deal signals to me that all of our worst thoughts about this conflict, like the worst possible outcomes that we envisioned, may in fact be materializing just in slow motion. Okay, everything is falling apart. The relationship with Turkey is falling apart. Turkey is still trying to play both sides of the fence. They're still saying things like NATO has to respect Russia's willingness to go back to the negotiating table for the grain deal, blah, blah, blah. And on the other side, they're sending all these weapons to Ukraine. They're calling for Ukraine to be integrated into NATO and Sweden into NATO, and they've returned the Azov commanders back much earlier than originally promised. And some people are coping with this miserably. Some far too optimistically in saying that, oh, well, this is just, you know, there's still some secret relationship between Erdogan and Putin, and they're playing 4D chess because they want to trade gas with one another and blah, blah, blah. And while that may be the case, you know, when it comes down to it at the end of the day, Turkey, at least at this point in time, stands to gain more by maintaining and continuing to be a member of NATO. Now, it could just be that Turkey is in some way held hostage by the United States and the NATO countries. I mean, there's nuclear weapons, the U.S. nuclear weapons within Turkey. So it could be that, if not militarily, economically, the U.S. has Turkey in the vice grips. But it's hard to say. So what we know right now is that the Wagner Group and Belarus is on a high state of alert. Poland is moving more troops in that direction. There's a lot of air defense that's going to have to be moved into place before any of these German companies or these Polish companies set up shop in Western Ukraine. We know that the air defense in Odessa has been annihilated. Okay, the Russians have been just laying it on thick. I'm talking about one ammunition depot after another. It's just been non-stop bombardments. And the thing is with the Russians, they can't brag about it as much as the Ukrainians because they're obviously they're the aggressor. They're viewed as the aggressor on the global stage. So for them to gloat and publish every video of every hit they make, and the fact that some people are saying that there's a 9-to-1 kill ratio, which I don't particularly believe, but I'm sure the ratio, at least in the counteroffensive, the seemingly failed counteroffensive, is much higher for the Ukrainians. The deaths are much higher for the Ukrainians than the Russians. We got cluster munition use becoming commonplace there, okay? And apparently, the other point of desperation for the Russians is that they're saying they're going to start to open service more to women, and they've walked back a recent policy that would minimize the draft age from 21 to 30. Now they're putting it back to 18 to 30, signaling that the draft may be coming soon there once again. Now we know that Ukraine is having its own share of problems mobilizing troops. There's all kinds of videos of the Gestapo chasing people down to put them in the backs of vans so that they can send them to the front lines to fight and die for NATO. But it appears as though they're not the only ones having their share of issues, okay? Now, Russia is currently doing live fire exercises in the Black Sea, signaling that they will take out any ship that enters the Black Sea in and around the Odessa region. So that's a pretty substantial threat. The Russians did, however, say they're not going to attack commercial vessels. So on the one hand, they're saying that, but they're also saying that we will target any ship that we perceive to be a military threat. So that could be any ship, because any cargo vessel could be carrying weapons, or could in fact itself be a military ship in disguise. So I'm sure that they're not going to be as discriminate as they say. Now, we have heat records continuing to be shattered around the world. That's kind of an aside story. But we also have a situation developing in Iran. 2,500 U.S. Marines now are heading to Iran. I've been getting a lot of messages about, and this always happens in the run-up to a deployment, that I get all kinds of emails from people that, they're getting messages from their relatives or people in the military that they've been called up. And apparently there's a lot of troops being sent, not to Iran, but in and around that region of the Strait of Hormuz, where Iran keeps seizing ships. And there's this back and forth between the Americans and the Iranians. Apparently there's a ship that the Americans have seized, I think off the coast of Texas, Galveston, for some time now. And so the Iranians are doing this tit for tat thing. And so they're sending F-35s, they're sending warships. It's looking like shit could pop off on the Strait of Hormuz right now. And this is the problem. As global economic conditions worsen, the incentive for global trade, which was at one point a protective factor against global conflict, global trade, and everybody making money, when that goes by the wayside, the likelihood for these conflicts that have been simmering for so long to flare up increases markedly. So it's not looking good. And the same thing with North Korea, who shot some missiles off in response to the fact that there's now, for the first time since 1981, a U.S. nuclear submarine docked at South Korean ports. Kim Jong-un doesn't like that a lot, considering they now have a substantial arsenal of nuclear weapons. We need to be incredibly careful. Taiwan is no different. Just the other day, a record amount of warships were encircling the island. Now, in the past 24 hours, a record number of planes, I believe it was around 50 planes, 50 Chinese warplanes entered the Taiwanese airspace, and of course returned as they typically do. So it seems like everywhere tensions are rising. The Senate rejected a war powers over NATO proposal recently. Now, this would have allowed the next president to effectively remove the U.S. from NATO. Unfortunately, the Senate, I think by a huge margin, it was something like 85-16 or something like that. They basically refused this proposed amendment, which would have allowed the president the executive branch to take the United States out of NATO without needing the Senate. So now the Senate still needs, you have to have Senate approval to remove the U.S. from NATO. I would have thought that that would have been the case all along, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe there was more to it. They've also rejected the war powers over NATO, which I think, which one was that again? This was what was it again? It was something to do with, was it that they can get out of Article 5 if they don't agree with it or something to that effect. But either way, there was two amendments. One was approved, one was opposed. Both of us put us on par for greater involvement in NATO and increasing likelihood that we're going to at some point engage the Russians and do the whole World War III thing. That's pretty much all you need to know. I mean, you can go and look into it in more depth if you so choose. Now, Ukraine is saying that Russia could be setting the stage for another possible false flag military operation at Zaporozhye nuclear power plant because it's that time of the month, right? Over the last 24 hours, the Kiev Post, so take it with a giant bag of salt, has evidence of a coordinated campaign that alleges that Ukrainian forces will attempt to seize Zaporozhye nuclear power plant before the end of July. That's what the Russians are saying, according to the Ukrainians. Okay, so we're playing a bit of a game of telephone. The Ukrainians are saying that the Russians are saying that the Ukrainians are going to do an attack before the end of July, and the Ukrainians are saying the reason why the Russians are saying this because the Russians are going to do a false flag. Does that make sense to you? Probably not. All you need to know is that usually whenever this news comes out, it's actually a good thing, because I do believe that nuclear incidents would have happened by now if both sides weren't screaming about it and telegraphing what the other side is going to do. I believe that this is a tactic that both sides use to prevent the other side from acting, because they could say, see, I told you so. We told you they were going to do it. So then they don't do it. So when they tell you they're going to do something, there's almost a good chance it's not going to happen. And they're just doing it as a intelligence flex, saying, yeah, well, we knew what you were up to, and so you better go back to the drawing board or plan that for another day, right? So anyways, It's not looking good, my friends. The price of rice is about to skyrocket, I do believe, unless this is only a temporary thing that India is doing to bring the price down and fill up their own silos of grain. But you know, the way things are going, I wouldn't be surprised that this stuck around for a while. Now, I seen another piece of news, and if you guys are in the military, you know, maybe this is a big nothing burger. I'm guessing it probably is. But apparently there's some, at Fort Benning, there's basic trainees who are doing a trench warfare training. Now, again, somebody posted this on Twitter, and it seemed to be met with surprise by a lot of people, although there are a few people in the comments who said, well, it's not that uncommon. It's not that everybody's going to do that type of training, but, you know, of course, people start thinking, well, is this because we are going to be partaking in some type of trench warfare that's currently going on? You know, it's possible. So I'll leave you on that note. And if you have any information about that, if that's a big nothing burger, like it may be, then please let me know in the comments section below. Keep on prepping, my friends, and go check out the video we released earlier today with good old Dr. Bones. And he provides some very critical, easy to understand info. First aid and medical treatment is going to be number one. I mean, you look at where, you know, a great way to how to strategize your preps is to look at where does government spend the most amount of money. Okay, so you got Social Security, healthcare, military. You know, so if you were to make a microcosm of that for your own preps, okay, so you have your, what does Social Security provide you? Food and shelter. What does healthcare provide you? Well, your medical treatment. So that's going to be a huge part of your preps. Because if and when something happens and there's no way to get help, that is going to be the only thing you care about, especially if it's family members, especially if it's your children or the elderly people in your family or your community. Medical is so overlooked by the gun guys, especially. Now, of course, a big part of the budget is military and policing. Don't get me wrong. But you can't just be focused on that. You have to be realistic and understand there is a very good chance if you're in a gunfight, you're going to get shot, unfortunately. And I say that as an example, but it could just be a cut. It could just be getting those antibiotics from Jace. It could be stockpiling your chronic medications. But the information provided by Dr. Bones in today's video that we did with him is all about burn treatment. Now, of course, if the bombs drop, there's going to be a lot of fires everywhere, and you're liable to get burned. Burns are going to happen in survival situations. So the information he shares is critical. It's very easy to understand, and his survival medicine handbook that we've promoted on the channel numerous times before is the one medical book. Well, there's a couple out there, but it's the biggest and most detailed and easy to follow. And in my opinion, one of the most comprehensive and accurate. It's the Survival Medicine Handbook, and it's for when help is not available. Okay, when there is no ambulance, when there is no doctor, you should always consult with a physician if you can. But that's not always going to be an option for people, especially if and when the grid goes down. If you don't know a doctor, if you don't know a nurse, you better have the Survival Medicine Handbook. Go check that video out, guys. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. And you might want to do yourself a favor and go and stock up on beans and rice while the getting is good, before the price hike cometh. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.